Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a review with nothing here on my desk because I'm talking about speakers and they wouldn't have fitted on my desk because they're big ones. Specifically what I'm talking about are the OAD Ultrafidelity Rigpas. A little while ago I reviewed the OAD Ultrafidelity Padma, which is a preamp. It was amazing, I loved it. Check out the review on that one if you haven't seen it already. And while I was talking to John from OAD Ultrafidelity, he was kind enough to introduce me to a prototype of the Rigpas and then invite me back to listen to the finished version once they were all ready to go. And I have to say, I've been really impressed. The Rigpas are an open-baffle design speaker. I know some of you are going to be huge fans of that. I certainly am. And they're coming out at a retail price of 9,000 Australian dollars, which will equate to about 6,100 US dollars. I'm awaiting confirmation from John about international distribution of these because OAD Ultrafidelity is an Australian company, but I do believe he's either organising or already has international distribution. And so regardless of where you are in the world, if you're interested in a wonderful sounding pair of open back speakers, then watch on as I introduce to you the OAD Ultrafidelity Rigpas. As I've already said, these are an open baffle design, they're a three-way speaker, and they're using what's called a dipole H-frame design. Essentially what we've got is a large woofer down the bottom. It's a 15-inch woofer if I remember correctly. I didn't take that detail down in my notes, but it's a large woofer down the bottom, and then we've got a mid-range driver and a tweeter up top. And there's a few unique features to the technologies chosen within each of the drivers, so I'll come back to those in a moment. But while we're still talking about the speakers as a whole, a few other technicalities worth talking about are that the sensitivity of these is rated at 90 decibels, and they've got a frequency response of 24 Hz through to 35 kHz. Minimum power requirements are quoted as 20 watts RMS, but they are very easy to drive. John was running them off one of the OAD Ultrafidelity power amps, and the VU meters were hardly moving because they need so little power to get the most out of them. These are a fairly large speaker, so they're going to be best suited to larger rooms, sort of medium to large rooms. And as you'll have seen in the B-roll, positioning of the speakers is somewhat important, particularly in terms of having to tow them in a little bit. Because they are an open baffle speaker, they tend to sort of create two zones of sound in front of them, so you do want to position those two zones overlapping at the point of listening. That said, the off-axis performance is good, as I'll talk about shortly, but before we get to my impressions of the sound quality, let's talk a little bit about some of the technology that's gone into the Rigpas. Working from the bottom and going up, starting off with a big woofer down the bottom, these have been a specifically chosen woofer by John to make sure that he got a very high SPL output. When you put a woofer like this in an open baffle design, and for those of you not familiar, open baffle means that you don't have a back on the speaker. So the drivers themselves are kind of floating in space, they've got a baffle which is the front panel, but they don't have anything around the back of them. What that results in is a design where you do lose some bass energy from your woofer. And so to counteract that, what John's done is chosen a woofer with particularly high sensitivity, and therefore you can still get plenty of bass to overcome the loss of bass from the open baffle design. Having heard them, I can tell you that it absolutely works, as we'll get to in the sound impressions. But before we get to that, let's now move up the speaker and talk about the tweeter. The tweeter in these is a planar tweeter, so somewhat similar to what's in the recently reviewed PS Audio FR30s. I say reviewed, it was more of the launch of them, the introduction to them. The tweeter being used here is a custom-made progressive drive and radiation tweeter. So essentially it's a planar magnetic driver, meaning it's incredibly fast and responsive. And John said that was the intention when he was designing these, was to get a sound that is very responsive, very fast, and therefore very insightful. The tweeters are then mounted inside a custom-made waveguide for the Rigpa, and that's going to mean that the treble energy is dispersed in the right way to give a really excellent image, and it works, I can tell you that much right now. But then if we move up above the tweeters, we've then got our mid-range driver. Again, this is a custom-made driver, it's a high excursion driver, and the reason John's had it designed and made as he has was to ensure that it's going to be able to provide a good amount of mid-bass. And so what that's doing is giving us a nice sense of body and richness in the mids. It's helping to allow the transition from the mid-range driver into the woofer to be really smooth and really clean. And then it's also been optimized for both on and off-axis listening. So the thing that became really clear to me as I talked more and more to John about these speakers is that none of this has been a quick decision. He hasn't just jumped online and gone, I can grab that driver and that driver and that driver. Many of them are custom made, and if not custom made in the case of the woofer, it's been very carefully selected from lots of different options to find just the right combination. And as you'll hear in a minute, it's really paid off. But before we get there is one more technology that I need to mention, and that is the way the crossover's been designed. The crossover itself is still just a crossover. There's no unique technologies as I understand it within the crossover, but what is unique is there's a network between the speakers and the crossover that means that the crossover always sees a consistent impedance. And the thinking behind this is that as impedance changes through the movement of a driver, so as a driver moves, it creates its own electromagnetic field within the voice coil, and so the various movements of the driver as it moves through different excursions at different frequencies is going to change its impedance. That impedance is then going to change the way the crossover influences which frequencies go to the driver. And so what John's done is design a network that goes between the speakers and the crossover so that the crossover itself sees a consistent and unchanging load when dealing with the speaker driver. The end result is consistent and predictable performance of the crossover with the driver no matter what the content is you're playing back. In turn, what that should theoretically mean is you're getting very linear performance of the drivers. You're not getting any strange peaks or troughs in their frequency response as the crossover has trouble managing which frequencies go through. Now this is starting to get beyond my understandings of the physics, and so I can only tell you how it sounds in the end, and that is to say it sounds fantastic. And this is a good chance to move now into the sound quality impressions because that's the bit that probably really matters. Every manufacturer out there is going to tell you all of the incredible technologies that they've built in and why it's the best thing ever. But if it doesn't all come down to a fantastic sounding end result, then none of it means much at all. The good news here is that in the case of the Rigpas, it's all come together to sound magic. These are a beautiful sounding speaker. For their $9,000 price tag, that's 9,000 Australian, so let's say $6,000 US, they're nothing short of exceptional. I've not compared them side by side with the PS Audio FR30s, but what I noticed as I listened to both was there's similarities between them, and I mean that in a good way. There are some things I think the Rigpas do better, and probably some things that I think the PS Audio FR30s do better, but my point is the Rigpas sound like a much more expensive speaker. I'm not saying they're a $30,000 speaker and directly compared to the FR30s, but my point is they're not leagues apart as the price suggests they should be. Probably the most important thing to me was just the naturality of the Rigpas. They produce one of those images where if you close your eyes and you're in the sweet spot, the speakers do 100% disappear. One of the tracks we listened to while I was demoing them with John was Feelin' Low Down by Andy Bay. The first thing I noticed on this track was when the piano came in off to the right, it was absolutely like the piano was in the room, both in terms of the image, but also the tonal accuracy. It sounded like a real piano from the lower notes all the way through to the top end. Tonality isn't 100% right, at least on the pair that I heard, I'll come back to that shortly, but the overall sense of naturalness and imaging accuracy is nothing short of wonderful. The bass from the Rigpas is solid and never boomy, and that's generally, as I understand it, one of the benefits of open-baffle speakers. They don't tend to set up any sort of room nodes, they don't tend to create the same degree of interactions with the room, and they also don't sound boxy. And that was very much what I was hearing from the bass from these. There was bass where it should be, it had good presence, it had good body, but it wasn't getting boomy, and it didn't matter where in the room I tended to go, I was never getting that sense of boomy or boxy sound. Admittedly, in some parts of the room where there were large obstacles in the way, I was losing some of the bass, but that's going to be true for any speaker with significant barriers in the way. It is going to block certain frequencies. Now, personally, when it comes to bass, I would probably want just a little tiny bit more out of them than what they're delivering, but it's not to say they're bass light. I think they're quite natural and neutral. I just like a slightly bassier, slightly more kind of thumpy sounding speaker. But we're talking here a couple of decibels. I'm not suggesting that they're far off the mark, I just like a bit more bass. The one area of tonality that for me wasn't quite right, and I've already alluded to this, was there was a little tiny bit of kind of shoutiness or overemphasis in the upper mids. And I was speaking to John about this as we did the listening. He actually agreed, and at the time he was already working on an adjustment of the crossover to fix that up. So I would expect that by the time anyone was to buy these, that's going to be tweaked, and it's going to sound nothing short of fantastic. What I was specifically hearing at the time was that things like female vocals could just get a little tiny bit forced, and we're talking a couple of % here. It depended very much on the recording, depended very much on the vocal, and even actually the source. As we changed through a few different sources, we were hearing that some sources tended to exacerbate the issue, whilst others almost got rid of it entirely. And so that's what I mean when I say it's a very, very tiny issue, and no doubt with a tweak made to the crossover, these were kind of like a final prototype. You could almost say they were like a golden sample almost, where they were just that final version for some very last moment tweaks. And so I expect the very finished version of the Rigpas to be absolutely exceptional. And in fact, as a sign of just how great I think they are, I don't have a lot more to say about them. They're so natural across the whole frequency range, they do such a great job of imaging, that there's very little more I can describe other than that they sound natural and real and like you're standing in the room with the musicians. Now, no doubt, you can spend a fortune more money and get even better sound. I'm not saying they're the best speaker on the planet. I'm not saying they're competing with hundreds of thousands of dollar speakers. But I think they're way outperforming their $6,000 price tag based on some of the speakers I've heard. And to help illustrate that, let me circle back around to that Andy Bay track that I spoke about before, which was Feelin' Lowdown, and just revisit that. I've already mentioned how great the piano sounded off to the right. It was full-bodied, it had richness, you could hear both the hit, the kind of percussive moment of hitting the keys, as well as the richness and resonance of the piano. And then Andy Bay's vocal had a wonderful sense of texture to it. You could hear the breathiness and the air, but also the fullness and the richness of the resonance within his chest and his head. Probably most impressive to me though was just the imaging quality. The fact that you could hear where the piano was, you could hear where Andy Bay was singing from, it was all beautifully rendered in space. Now this is a good time to mention that it does depend on exactly where you're placed. If I was sitting on John's lounge in the listening room, I was a bit too close and the image wasn't quite as clear. So whilst a central vocal may have still been in the right position, it wasn't as clearly defined around the edges, so it was more of a blob of sound within a space. Whereas if I moved back a little bit in the room and stood behind the lounge, that's when I would suddenly get this absolute crystal clear image of exactly where the vocalist was. And so these are a speaker where you kind of need to be in the sweet spot to get the absolute peak performance. But the good news is that if you're not in the sweet spot, you're still getting wonderful sound. The image is just a little bit more diffuse. Another track that we tried, and I didn't write down or take notice of which one it was a Frank Sinatra track from one of his earlier type albums based on the sound of it. Something like one of the tracks off In the Wee Small Hours or one of those recordings. And what really struck me listening to the Rigpas with this song was you could actually kind of hear that Frank was standing in his own space with the microphone, and then the rest of the orchestra and the rest of the band were sort of distant behind him, either because it was mixed after the fact or because that's how it was set up live on the occasion. But the sense of separation and clarity while still being coherent, so it wasn't kind of overly separating things like I sometimes talk about with headphones. What it was doing was it was giving you the sense of exactly where Frank was and exactly where the rest of the band was. Another thing I noticed was that I really got a sense of kind of how far away Frank was from the microphone. You could almost imagine and picture, based on the sound that you were hearing, you could picture exactly where the mic was, the angle of it, where Frank was probably standing, and how he was approaching the microphone. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that I can actually predict or tell you exactly what was going on there, but what I'm saying was that the quality of the sound was able to conjure those images in my head. So I found myself imagining what it would look like because it sounded so accurate to that. So again, I don't want to suggest that I can say, oh, at this moment he was 20 centimeters away and looking upward at a 10-degree angle. I don't mean that. I mean that it produced just a wonderful sense of imaging and a sense of realism that you could absolutely feel changing distances from the mic, his general positioning near the mic, those general terms you could absolutely sense. And so after listening to the Rigpas across a bunch of different tracks, some tracks I didn't know, some tracks that I did, some of my sort of standard listening tracks, after listening to them for a while, I'm pretty astonished that they're priced as low as they are. To me, I think OAD Ultrafidelity could be selling them for more than $6,000 quite easily. I think if they were pumped up to $10,000, they're still going to be a really good competitive option. That said, I didn't get the sense from John that there was any intention to price them higher. The sense that I got was he was just excited to get them out there into the world. And so if you like the idea of open-baffle speakers, if you've been looking for a pair of wonderful transparent speakers with a great image that are quite transparent in the sense that you can actually close your eyes and they disappear, if you're in that sort of a market, then you should absolutely check out the Rigpas, I think. I should mention at this point, and maybe I should have mentioned earlier, I have no affiliation with OAD Ultrafidelity. John's a lovely guy and I've spent quite a lot of time talking to him, but there's no benefit to me if you buy those speakers or any others, and as such I also don't have any specific links to share with you other than to the OAD Ultrafidelity page. And so you might have to do a little bit of hunting to find out where to buy these. If I can find out more, I'll put some links in the description down below to the retailers that are going to be carrying these, or maybe already carry them by the time this video comes out. But once again, I want to stress there's no affiliation, there's no benefits to me if you buy them. I was just personally really impressed with what I heard. The final thing I should point out is that you would have seen in the Glamour videos that these were painted in white and the backs were black. I believe the finished versions, you're going to be able to get custom colours and they might not have the two-tone effect. So the backs of them I think are going to be the same colour as the front, but I'll let that be confirmed by the website and any inquiries you want to put through to OAD Ultrafidelity or any retailers that you're able to find or that I can put in the links down below. For now though, I want to close this off by saying thank you to John for introducing me to the speakers, thank you for giving me the chance to introduce them to the world, and to all of you watching, if you're in the market for a speaker and you want a wonderful experience for a very affordable price based on the quality, then absolutely check out the OAD Ultrafidelity Rigpas. And if you do try them out, if you have had a listen, let us know in the comments down below what you thought about them. Being a new speaker from a brand that's not really known for speakers, it'd be great to get some people sharing their thoughts down below to help others make their decisions. And speaking of decisions, if you found this video useful, helpful, or interesting in making your decisions, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you next time on Passion for Sound.